For most of their history, Western nations never had to ask this question. But in the past 3 decades, as mass immigration, refugee waves, and globalization have reshaped demographics, it's become unavoidable. Has multiculturalism failed in the West? In this video, I'll break down how multiculturalism has unfolded in the West, where it has succeeded, where it has failed, and why, as an ex-Muslim, I believe the cracks are becoming impossible to ignore. First, we need to take a step back and look at how migration has shaped the West historically. Because contrary to what some people might think, migration isn't new. For most of its history, movement between regions was limited. Obviously, you couldn't just pack up and fly over for most of human history. People didn't really move across the world unless war, famine, or conquest forced them to. Pre-modern migration was slow and usually regional. People moved within the same cultural sphere. Even in early modern Europe, migration wasn't mass scale. Sure, you had traders, mercenaries, and refugees, but entire populations weren't being reshuffled. Most of the migration that did happen in Europe was actually between European nations. You had Germans moving into Eastern Europe, French Huguenots fleeing to Protestant countries, and Irish migrants settling in England and America. However, overall, these groups, despite their national differences, largely shared the same cultural and religious foundations: Christianity, European traditions, and similar social structures. And of course, there was colonialism. European empires expanded, carving up the globe and setting the stage for the migration patterns we see today. People from colonized regions were brought into European economies, first through forced labor and later through work programs. After World War II, Europe was in ruins. Cities were bombed out, economies were struggling, and there was a massive labor shortage. Countries like Britain, France, and the Netherlands needed workers fast. And where did they turn? Their former colonies. From the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa, waves of migrants arrived under government-backed programs to fill jobs in industries like manufacturing, transport, and healthcare. Britain had the Windrush generation, with thousands of Caribbean immigrants arriving under the British Nationality Act of 1948, which gave them the right to settle permanently as Commonwealth citizens. France recruited workers from North and West Africa, granting many of them legal residency. The Netherlands saw an influx from Indonesia and Suriname, with Dutch citizenship often extended to these migrants. Then there was Germany. Unlike Britain or France, Germany didn't have a colonial connection to draw from. So, in the 1960s, they signed agreements with countries like Italy, Greece, and most notably, Turkey, bringing in hundreds of thousands of Turkish workers under the Gastarbeiter program. The idea was simple: they would come, work, and then go home. At least that was the plan. But as with other migration waves in Europe, many stayed, and family reunification policies saw Turkish communities grow into permanent fixtures of German society. But this wasn't just a European phenomenon. Canada and Australia also opened their doors to mass migration, though their approach was slightly different. In Canada, after World War II, the government actively encouraged immigration to boost their workforce and expand the economy. At first, most immigrants came from other Western nations: Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. But by the 1960s, Canada abolished its race-based immigration policies, replacing them with a points-based system that prioritized skilled workers rather than national origin. This led to a huge influx of immigrants from non-European countries, especially from China, India, and the Middle East. By the 1980s, multiculturalism wasn't just an accidental result of immigration. It was an official government policy, with Canada branding itself as one of the most diverse nations in the world. Australia had a similar trajectory. After World War II, Australia was desperate for more people, fearing that its small population made it vulnerable. The government launched the Populate or Perish campaign, actively encouraging immigration, particularly from Britain and other European nations. This led to the arrival of 2 million people, including Greeks, Italians, and Yugoslavs. However, by the 1970s, Australia, like Canada, abandoned its White Australia policy, leading to a large-scale migration from Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Overall, none of this was truly framed as multiculturalism. It was just economic necessity. These migrants were expected to integrate into the workforce, and in many cases, it was assumed they might eventually return home. But why would many of them return to abject poverty when they had built better lives for themselves and their families in the West? The jobs were stable, the living conditions were better, and their children had access to education and opportunities they could never have dreamed of back home. For many, going back wasn't just unrealistic, it was never even a consideration. Policies soon shifted to allow them to stay long-term, and family reunification laws meant their communities grew. What started as a labour program became something much bigger. Western societies weren't just importing workers anymore, they were reshaping themselves. And that's where the real debate over multiculturalism began. Before we go any further, we need to talk about culture. Because if we don't define what we mean by it, the entire debate around multiculturalism doesn't make sense. A lot of people think of culture as something fixed, as if it's set in stone, passed down unchanged from one generation to the next. But that's not how it works. Culture is fluid, it evolves, it's constantly being shaped by history, politics, and social forces. Thinkers like Clifford Geertz talked about this in his work on interpretive anthropology, where he argued that culture isn't just a set of traditions, but a web of meanings that people construct through symbols, stories, and shared practices. So how is culture actually transmitted? Through language, religion, traditions, and shared symbols. These are the main carriers of cultural identity. Whether it's the way people dress, the holidays they celebrate, or the values they pass on, culture spreads through these everyday mechanisms. And even the little things like celebrating Christmas or having a shared national language matter more than people think. In an era where some are quick to dismiss these as trivial or outdated, it's worth remembering that these small cultural markers are often what hold a society together. Strip them away and what's left? And that's where things get a bit complicated. What happens when cultures collide? This is where acculturation theory comes in. In the 1980s, psychologist John Bari developed a model that explains how people adapt when they move to a new cultural environment. He outlined 4 main strategies that migrants and even host societies take. First, there's assimilation. This is when someone basically ditches their original culture and fully adopts the new one. They change their name, stop speaking their native language, and do everything they can to blend in. I'd like to think this is the part where I'd fit in, though I'm still waiting for my honorary slab of VB and hopefully an invite to a Holden owners meetup. Then there's integration, which is what most people would call the ideal balance. They adapt to the new culture, learn the language, take on local customs, but still keep parts of their original identity. This is probably the best case scenario for multicultural societies when it actually happens. Then you've got separation. This is when an immigrant rejects the new culture entirely and just sticks to their own community. This is where you start seeing parallel societies, where people live in the same country but don't actually interact with the larger society. And finally, there's marginalization, which is the worst case scenario. This is when someone feels disconnected from both cultures. They don't fit in with the country they've moved to, but they've also lost touch with their original identity. That kind of alienation can lead to some serious social problems. These strategies in general shape entire societies. Some countries push for assimilation, like France with its strict secularism, while others embrace multicultural integration like Canada with its mosaic model. Sometimes it's hard to gauge how mainstream media may be presenting how this has been implemented in multiple countries, especially today. That's why it's so important to know who owns the media and understand their biases, and that's where Ground News comes in. Ground News is an app and website that compiles thousands of news articles into one place to give you the complete picture, including biases and who actually owns the media source. They've become invaluable for me and makes it easy to see how different media sources frame the same events. Take this article on the MPs voting against a national inquiry into the grooming gang. Ground News reveals that 57% of the sources reporting on this story lean right, while only 18% lean left, making this a potential blind spot for that side. Looking at the headlines, some left-wing sources like the London Economic reported heavily on Elon Musk's input on this issue, whereas some right-leaning media, such as The Telegraph, which first broke the scandal, presented the views of survivors. The centre, like the Oldham Times, instead avoided using loaded language and focused on the national inquiry instead. This kind of biased distribution shows us how narratives are shaped and which perspectives might be underrepresented. Another feature I love is the blind spot feed, which highlights stories that the left or right might be overlooking. It's especially helpful if you want a full understanding of the issues beyond what you see on social media. You can also sign up to their blind spot report, a newsletter that shows what's happening at the extremes of news bias, and have it come straight to your inbox. It helps you see how each side frames major issues and what they might be ignoring. I've been a user for years now, and I genuinely think you'd love their platform as well, which you can check out at ground.news/dingo. Go check them out at ground.news/dingo or scan the QR code on screen to get started. You can join for less than $1 a month or use my link in the description to get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan. Thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Now, let's jump back in. But when separation is allowed to fester and ends up dominating, that's when you start seeing the cracks in multiculturalism. Here's the thing. When Bari came up with this model, immigration was happening at a significantly smaller scale. No one was planning for what we're seeing today. Let's look at the numbers. In the UK, for example, net migration hit almost 750,000 in 2022, a record high. Canada, in 2023, the government admitted over 1 million immigrants, the most ever recorded in a single year. That's over 2.5% of the entire population in just 12 months. In Australia, net migration in 2023 was roughly 500,000 people, when pre-pandemic levels were around 180,000. That's nearly triple the usual rate. Germany saw a net migration of 1.5 million people in 2022, the highest level since records began in 1950. And that's on top of the 1.3 million Syrians taken in over the past decade. And finally, across the European Union, in 2022, 5.1 million immigrants arrived from non-EU countries, more than double the 2.4 million recorded in 2021. For years, we've been told that mass migration is inevitable, that it's just the way things are, that resisting it is irrational, even immoral. But this is untrue. The numbers we're seeing now are at historical highs and at a rather rapid pace too. On top of this, across the Western world, people have consistently voted against it, and yet it keeps happening. Look at the UK. Brexit wasn't just about the EU. It was a clear rejection of uncontrolled migration. The promise was tighter borders, controlled numbers, and national sovereignty. Although, ironically, post-Brexit, things did become even worse. In Sweden, once a poster child of progressive immigration policies, voters flipped hard right in the 2022 election, fed up with rising gang violence, immigrant-dominated no-go zones, and a government that refused to acknowledge the problem. Even in Germany, where Angela Merkel's "We Can Do This" refugee policy in 2015 opened the floodgates, public sentiment has shifted dramatically. The alternative for Germany, or the AfD, once a fringe party, is now polling at record highs because mainstream politicians refuse to address mass migration concerns. And then there's Australia, where every poll for years has shown that the majority of Australians want lower immigration levels. Housing shortages are through the roof, wages are stagnating, and major cities are struggling to keep up. In Canada, the Conservatives likely are about to win the next election. This is from the country where this guy had a stronghold for years now.
Is the love that's going to change the future of mankind. So we'd like you to look into
we
that.
like to say people kind, not necessarily mankind.
It's the same pattern everywhere. Across political spectrums, across countries, the majority of people reject mass, uncontrolled migration. And yet, somehow, it never stops. So why is that? Why does it seem like no matter how people vote, migration levels keep increasing? Douglas Murray calls it the strange death of Europe, the slow erosion of national identity under the weight of mass migration. Western governments, media, and institutions have spent decades convincing themselves that multiculturalism is an unquestionable good, that a nation's identity isn't defined by shared values or culture, but by how many people it can take in. But when the numbers get this high, integration doesn't just slow down, it stops altogether. And at first, it sounded reasonable. The promise was simple. Different cultures could coexist in the same country, side by side in harmony, respecting each other's traditions, while contributing to the broader national identity. Immigrants would bring their unique perspectives and customs while also embracing the core values of their new home. That was the theory. The reality has been quite different. Rather than fostering mutual respect and cultural exchange, multiculturalism, as it has been practiced in the West, has often led to self-segregation and the formation of parallel societies. Instead of melting into a shared national culture, many migrant groups have remained isolated, maintaining their own customs, legal systems, and even political allegiances, often at odds with the country they moved to. Governments assumed integration would happen on its own, that simply living in a Western country would make migrants adopt Western values. Perhaps that was true when migration was smaller and culturally aligned. For most of history, Western nations primarily took in European migrants who shared similar religious, linguistic, and social values. As I mentioned previously, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, millions of Irish, Italians, and Eastern Europeans arrived in the US, Canada, Australia, and the UK. They faced discrimination at first, but gradually assimilated. Even post-World War II, most migration still came from culturally compatible nations, like Italians and Greeks in Australia, or Poles and Germans in Britain. And this is the part Western governments completely ignored. Not all cultures are equally compatible with liberal democracy. Some values simply do not mix. And when migration happens at an unsustainable scale, it's the host country's culture that ends up being forced to accommodate, not the other way around. Having been born in an Islamic nation and knowing firsthand how the world is viewed through an Islamic lens, I can assure you, this isn't just a personal observation. I'm not the first to say it, and I won't be the last. In fact, serious intellectuals and academics have been warning about this for years. Take Douglas Murray, for example. In The Strange Death of Europe, he argues that multiculturalism isn't just a policy, it's a dogma, something that cannot be questioned even when the evidence shows it's failing. Western nations have convinced themselves that prioritizing diversity over unity will somehow lead to a stronger society. But instead of integration, we're seeing the opposite: fragmentation, parallel societies, and cultural conflicts. This isn't just a cultural problem, it's a social and economic one too. Paul Collier, an economist and author of Exodus: How Migration is Changing Our World, explains that mass migration, when unmanaged, erodes social trust and creates long-term economic divisions. Societies thrive when there's a shared sense of identity and responsibility. But when millions of people arrive in short time frames without integration, without shared values, the system starts to break down. The communities don't mix, the economy becomes stratified, and the entire concept of a cohesive national identity disappears. And it's not just a theory. There's hard data backing it up. Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam found that in more diverse societies, social trust doesn't just decline between different groups, it declines within groups too. People interact less, communities become weaker, and instead of creating a multicultural utopia, we end up with a fragmented, disconnected society where no one truly belongs. Which brings me to Islam. All the authors I mentioned previously, plus more, have pointed out the same uncomfortable reality. Islam presents a unique challenge to Western multiculturalism. This isn't just my conclusion as an ex-Muslim. It's something that's been studied, written about, and warned about for decades. Christopher Caldwell, in Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, doesn't just argue that mass Muslim immigration is changing Europe, he argues that it's replacing it. Western leaders, in their arrogance, assumed that assimilation would just happen on its own, that simply being in Europe would be enough to turn migrants into Europeans. But instead, we have seen the opposite. Large Muslim populations don't integrate into Western societies the way previous migrant groups did. Instead, they form separate, self-governing communities where Islamic values and customs take priority over the laws and norms of the countries they now live in. And new migrants no longer face the challenge of integration. They can simply live in these enclaves with virtually no change in how they used to live. Islam is not just a religion in the way Christianity or Buddhism is. It's a political and legal system, one that doesn't just seek to coexist with Western democracy, but to supersede it. I know this because I grew up in it. In Islamic theology, the world is divided into two categories: the abode of Islam and the abode of war. The first refers to lands under Islamic rule where Sharia is enforced. The second, any place that isn't yet ruled by Islam. And that word yet is crucial, because according to this worldview, non-Islamic societies are not just different, they're temporary. They're territories to be brought under Islamic governance, whether through migration, political influence, or, if necessary, by force. How about I let some Western Muslims tell you in their own words?
You should those empires around you, or those hukumat around you, which are Jew or Christian, until they give the jizya. That's fine. That we already know Islam allows.
Now, legally, when Muslims live in places like Britain, for example, which feel legally we would classify Britain as Darul Harb, right? Which is, if you translate it, it's abode of war.
The kuffar from Dar al-Harb, there can never be a permanent treaty with the kuffar because it cancels out jihad. It can't be forever. When Muslims get stronger and it's a benefit for the Muslims, they inform the enemy, this treaty has come to an end.
The evidence, unfortunately, has become clearer as the years have gone by. Look at what's happening right now. The moment you criticize Islam publicly, you're in danger. Charlie Hebdo, Samuel Paty, the Batley Grammar School teacher forced into hiding after showing a Muhammad cartoon. More recently, Salman Bhumika. In any other context, we would call this what it is, an attempt to enforce blasphemy laws on Western soil. But because it involves Islam, politicians, media, and the so-called intellectual class refuse to acknowledge it for what it is. And that's not even touching on the massive impact on crime, women's safety, and public order in countries that have taken in large numbers of Muslim migrants. Sweden was once one of the safest countries in the world. Today, it has one of the highest rates of SA in Europe. And who's behind it? The Swedish government itself admits that migrant backgrounds are overwhelmingly represented in these crimes, yet no one is allowed to talk about it. In fact, recently in the UK, a sitting MP explicitly called for official blasphemy laws. Germany saw it in 2015, when Angela Merkel's refugees welcome policy led to the Cologne New Year's Eve essay, where over 1,200 women were assaulted in a single night by groups of men, most of whom had arrived from North Africa and the Middle East. The UK saw it with the grooming gang scandals, where Pakistani Muslim men systematically targeted underage British girls, while police and politicians ignored it for decades out of fear of being called racist. And yet, despite all of this, Western leaders continue to push mass immigration, multiculturalism, and accommodation of Islamic values, even when it directly conflicts with their own laws, their own freedoms, and their own citizens' safety. Many years ago, when I moved to the West due to a fear for my life, I would have never imagined I would see this. Maybe I was naive. Maybe I thought there was no way the values and customs I had escaped from would be defended, protected, and even encouraged in the West years later. But here we are. If we're going to fix this, we need to start by admitting the truth. Western multiculturalism as it exists today has failed. It was built on naive assumptions that integration would just happen naturally, that all cultures were equally compatible, that national identity didn't really matter, that after decades of trial and error, the results speak for themselves. That doesn't mean the answer is shutting the gates completely or falling into some kind of ethno-nationalist fantasy. That's neither realistic nor desirable in a world where nations still matter. But it does mean we need to start making immigration work for the country, not the other way around. The good news? Western nations don't have to start from scratch. There are countries that have actually figured this out. Countries that have managed to balance immigration with national stability because they never lost sight of one fundamental truth. A nation is not just a collection of people who happen to live in the same place. It's a shared culture, a shared history, a shared set of values. And if migration policies don't prioritize that, they will always fail. Take Singapore and, well, ironically, the UAE. These countries have large numbers of foreigners, far more than most Western nations. But they never pretend that citizenship and temporary residency are the same thing. In Singapore, around 40% of the population is foreign-born, but citizenship is incredibly difficult to obtain, and it comes with strict expectations of national loyalty. In the UAE, Nearly 90% of the population consists of migrants, but almost none of them are granted citizenship. They are there to work, not to reshape the country. And another key point, there's no automatic welfare for immigrants. Then there's Japan and South Korea, where immigration is highly controlled, cultural integration is mandatory, and national identity is protected above all else. There's no government effort to accommodate foreign customs, no parallel legal systems, no political pressure to diversify their population just for the sake of it. Even in Europe, we're seeing countries like Denmark start to realize their mistakes. Denmark has moved towards strict migrant quotas, enforced integration policies, and reduced asylum incentives. And as a result, it's one of the only Western nations where public trust in immigration policy has actually increased. And here's the other obvious lesson. If you want immigration to work, the numbers have to be sustainable. If too many people arrive too quickly, integration doesn't just slow down, it stops altogether. It's not about race. It's not about shutting people out completely. It's about simple math. If you keep importing people at a rate faster than they can assimilate, you don't get a multicultural society. You get multiple separate societies living in the same space, and sooner or later, that turns into conflict. But reducing immigration alone also isn't enough. Integration has to be mandatory, not optional. For decades, Western nations have treated integration like some sort of bonus, a nice outcome if it happens. That needs to change. If someone wants to move to a country, they should be expected to learn the language, understand the laws, and adopt the core values that make that country function. Other nations do this without hesitation. In Japan and South Korea, if you don't learn the language and adapt to the culture, you simply won't function in society. In Denmark, migrants are expected to meet clear cultural and economic benchmarks before becoming full members of society. In Singapore, cultural harmony isn't just encouraged, it's enforced. Western countries need to do the same. No more government-funded cultural enclaves, no more parallel societies, and no more immediate welfare once you arrive on a boat. One country, one culture. But even that isn't enough if the country itself doesn't believe in its own identity, and that's where the real failure has been. For decades, the West has been apologizing for itself, watering down its own traditions, erasing its own history, and bending over backwards to accommodate cultures that refuse to integrate. A nation should never feel ashamed to assert its own identity and values. If a country expects new arrivals to assimilate, it has to believe in itself enough to demand it. Right now, the biggest advantage Islamic migrants have over the West is that they believe in their own identity more than the West does. They arrive with strong cultural foundations, strong religious convictions, and zero hesitation about enforcing their worldview. Meanwhile, Western countries are terrified of even saying, "This is our culture, and if you live here, you need to respect it." Look, I'm not one of those zero immigration zealots on X. I believe becoming part of the West is a great privilege and should be something so valuable that it's not easy to obtain. Because if they don't, they'll be erasing their own culture in the name of inclusivity. If other nations can assert their own values and demand integration, why is the West the only civilization too afraid to defend itself? The West still has time to decide what it wants to be. The only question left is whether it has the courage to choose survival over self-destruction. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give the video a like. I'd also love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let me know what you think. A huge thank you to my current channel members and Patreon supporters. Your support makes all of this possible. And if you'd like to join them, consider becoming a member by hitting the join button below or heading over to Patreon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.